Are you ready to take a trip down memory lane with me today? Because what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through my experience with various ID software and kind of talk about what's been happening in the instructional design, e-learning, ed tech field for the last 20 years as far as software development goes. The reason I want to do this is there's a big focus, and there always has been. I was that person in like 2002, 2003, who was focused on software and e-learning development. And just kind of talk about that transition, because if you are someone getting into the e-learning field and your focus is that portfolio and only the software, really, there's a trend right now with people just focused on those pieces. I want to talk about what you can kind of expect to experience in the future, because I'll tell you what I experienced going through, and I'm seeing a lot of recurrent patterns for a lot of reasons. So when I first got in the field, I first got in the field in 2001 when I started getting my master's degree. I graduated with my master's in like the end of 2002, like January 03. Well, I technically didn't graduate till 03, like that May, but I left my program that December for an internship and never went back. So technically end of 2002 is when I started work. Now I was huge as an undergrad into computer programming, software like Photoshop, Flash, Dreamweaver. I had a lot of experience coming into my master's in ID. So I picked up on ID software like it was nothing, like so easy. It was like cutting through butter. Like people in my classes were coming to me for questions and help. So I really like enjoyed that part of it. I loved development, and really got into development. So we're going to go through the software. So when I first started, and I'm ignoring software like for now, like about like Photoshop and Dreamweaver and like the extra software that we use as IDs. I want to focus on like the authoring software that IDs use to develop e-learning courses. So when I first got into the field, it was kind of an interesting time. So around the late 90s, Flash emerged on the scene. When I came on the field in like the early 2000s, Flash was starting to become like the it thing, but I got to see the software that was being used before I left the field. So the software that was being used, and I learned some of this software in my master's program. I learned a piece of software called Director, which y'all probably haven't heard of, Authorware, which you probably haven't heard of, Toolbook, which you probably haven't heard of, and this obscure program called RoboDemo that none of you have probably heard of, although it eventually turned into Captivate, so you all have heard of it. But Director, Authorware, and Toolbook were basically like plug and play pieces of software. And then you had to know, Photoshop, Illustrator, Dreamweaver, and stuff like that. But around that time, what happened is this new piece of software emerged on the scene. And what this piece of software did, so the problem with Director, Authorware, and Toolbook is they were e-learning pieces of software, but they were limited in functionality. So you were having all these issues, like, let's say you wanted to do something that the software didn't do, you were just stuck. You couldn't do anything. So what happened is this piece of software called Flash came on the scene. And all of a sudden, Flash is like, whoa, you could build what you could build in Authorware and Director. It took more time, but you could do anything you wanted because it had its own programming language called ActionScript. At the time, it was ActionScript 1.0, and it eventually switched to 2.0, 3.0, which is more similar to JavaScript. But you could do whatever you wanted. It just took a lot longer, but you could do whatever you wanted. And all of a sudden, there was this huge demand for Flash developers. I was a Flash developer. I knew ActionScript because I had a programming background, knew it really well. Now, at the same time, around that time, there was something emerging on the scene, which was called DHTML. DHTML. And basically what that was is it was a combination of HTML4, JavaScript, and CSS. And everyone was kind of saying, like, this is the next big thing. Everyone needs to learn DHTML. And that didn't happen because Flash just blew up. So from like 2001 to like 2008, Flash was like it. I was hired on a number of consulting projects to just help them troubleshoot something in Flash because I knew it so well. Then around like 2008, 2009, I'm kind of probably mixing up the years a little bit. When the iPhone came onto the scene, there was a lot of issues with what was happening with Flash and the iPhone. And the reason that we were having these issues, and not just with iPhone, but with all mobile devices, is that Flash required an extension to play called Flash Player. So all computers had Flash Player. And the unfortunate thing with Flash Player is that it was a third-party software. You had to always install it. It was always kind of a pain, always had to be updated. So from an end user perspective, Flash Player was a nightmare. From a programmatic, programmer perspective, Flash was also a nightmare because it was always changing security, it was messing with browsers, always some kind of issue with Flash Player. So it caused all kinds of headaches for people. Even though it worked really well, and when it worked great, and it did work great most of the time, but it seemed like every day there was like a new update for it. So it was a big pain for end users and programmers. So eventually what happened was, and I guess I should say the advantage of Flash Player, what made Flash Player awesome, is that it would always publish whatever you made in Flash. So like if you made the coolest game or piece of e-learning or whatever you made, I could make Microsoft Word in Flash. Like you could make anything in it. You knew it would run in Flash Player. And that was the beauty of Flash. There were other things that were really great about it too, but that was like the biggest thing in my opinion, is that you knew it was going to work. It ran in everything. Wherever Flash Player ran, your software was going to work. So what happened is when you got to the mobile device, installing Flash Player on a mobile device just was never going to be an option. It was never going to work. Steve Jobs called him out on it and said, like, we're done. We're not even going to try this because it's just too much of a nightmare. And basically what he did is with that statement, everyone was kind of like, yeah, this is a problem. And Flash isn't working well on mobile devices, so what are we going to do? When that happened, the whole e-learning world kind of got flipped on its head. Now, we were flipped on its head in like 2010, 11, 12 because of the economy crash too. But that's a different story that I'm not talking about. But basically what happened is the whole world of e-learning got flipped on its head. And all of a sudden, we didn't have any good software. And when I say we didn't have any good software, here were the issues. So companies were used to all the cool stuff Flash could do. And all the software that we had out there couldn't come close to matching it. It just wasn't customizable at all. So what was happening is I was getting a lot of inquiries and like companies were coming to me like, well, look, we need this piece of, this is like 2009 to like 2014 or 15. It was kind of like this weird dark period. And a lot of different cool things happened in this time. So first of all, HTML5 started to become like a thing. Now, HTML5 was really like the upgrade of what we call DHTML. So DHTML was HTML4, CSS, JavaScript. HTML5 was HTML5, CSS, JavaScript. Yeah, we upgraded CSS in there too, but basically it was the same thing. So what we had started to do in like this early 2000s with DHTML was finally taking hold. The reason it was taking hold is because if you created something using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, it was going to work on every device. It was going to work on your mobile device. It was going to work on your tablet. It was going to work on your computer. And it really didn't matter what kind of computer or anything. Like it would work on your Mac, your PC, pretty much all browsers, as long as they were keeping up with the standards, it was going to work on all browsers too. Now, old browsers were going to have some issues with HTML5, but it still solved a lot of problems. The issue that instructional designers have is if you were an ID, instructional designer, e-learning developer, learning experience, whatever you would want to call yourself, and you were a developer and that's what you did, as soon as Flash basically was like overnight, Flash wasn't used anymore. You had to learn how to be a computer programmer because HTML, while HTML itself is a simple language, if you didn't understand CSS and especially JavaScript, man, you had to learn how to program because that's what companies all of a sudden wanted. It was like, we want HTML5. And now at this time, so Macromedia had bought out RoboDemo and changed it to Captivate, and then Adobe bought Captivate when they bought out Macromedia. I think that's I know Adobe bought out like a bunch of stuff. Like Adobe bought Flash and Dreamweaver and stuff and became Adobe software in like the 2004, 5, 6, 7, something like that. But what happened is that there was some software emerging, and this software was Captivate, was slowly emerging on the scene. The problem with Captivate is Captivate at the time was really only used, so Robo Demo, when I talk about like 2001, was only used for screen captures. It was basically snag it with like an e-learning twist. It's the only time you ever used Captivate was when you had to do screen captures or something and you could create some e-learning, but it was never used for like e-learning development. And all of a sudden, instructional designers didn't really have anything. I mean, there was some crummy software out there that we were trying to use, but like if you publish something in Captivate, because I had like companies coming to me and they were like, well, we want this in our Captivate or Articulate now, all of a sudden is on the scene. And I was like, well, it's just, that's great, but it's not going to work on the mobile device. It didn't work on the mobile device because like Captivate was relying on Flash Player. I was like, you guys got to do this in JavaScript. Like that's your option. And then what happened is Adobe decided, okay, we're going to change Flash and we're going to allow it to publish in HTML5. So instead of Flash Player, it's going to publish in HTML5. And then they slowly made that switch to Captivate as well. They were going to have Captivate publish in HTML5. Now, there were a few issues that happened here at this time. Basically what happened is Flash just had a bad reputation. So Adobe was like, we got to scrap Flash. Even though Flash is great and now can publish in HTML5, it just has a bad rep. So what Adobe did is they turned Flash into what's called Adobe Animate. So technically, Flash is still alive. It's called Adobe Animate now, and it's not really used for software design, for e-learning anymore, because it takes a lot more time than Captivate. But the advantage of Animate, which is former Flash, is that you can literally, all the issues that you have with your clients in Captivate and Articulate are pretty much solved in Animate. It just takes like 3 to 5 times longer to develop. There's still some SCORM issues, but all of that stuff you can work around. It just takes a lot longer to develop. It really does. And what they did with Captivate, and then what Articulate started doing, is they started to see this need, and they started to say, okay, well, let's figure out how to publish our stuff in HTML5. So they did that. And it was actually a brilliant solution by these companies to do that, because all of a sudden, we didn't need this Flash Player thing anymore, and we could still do all our stuff. The downfall, and this is where we are right now, actually, current time. So let's get to current time where we have this Articulate and Captivate. The problem that we have with these pieces of software is they're limited by what we can. They have those same limitations that we had in 2001 with Director, Authorware, and Toolbook. We are limited by the software. So it's like we're back to square one. I work with a lot of clients, and we use a lot of mostly. Articulate is what we use a lot more. We're doing a lot with Rise as well, but we use a lot of Articulate Storyline and some Captivate. And the issues that we have with both pieces of software, Articulate Storyline or Adobe Captivate, is that we're limited by what the software does. Now, each piece of software has back-end JavaScript into it built, so you can program what you want in JavaScript. The issue that we run into with that is when we publish things, it's not necessarily working the way that like an HTML file would work in JavaScript. There are a lot of limitations with what the JavaScript's allowing us to do in these pieces of software. Even though I might program it correctly, Articulate doesn't want to work it because the way the published file is, it's just not going to show up. It's not going to work right. So I'm actually, in some cases, considering going back and just doing the whole thing in HTML5 versus Captivate to begin with. Taking the assets and developing it that way, because there are just lots of issues. So we're like back to this. It's like we started with this software. We got into a cool piece of software that allowed programming, but it had issues. That got killed off by the mobile device. Then we created some software again, and now we have this software. And again, we're back to square one. That the software, we have these limitations in the software. Both Adobe and Articulate see the limitations in the software. That's why we have actions, triggers and stuff in these pieces of software, so we can start to do some low level, really simple low level programming. But what I see for the future is that this software needs to significantly expand. It either needs to, we need to open up and allow full JavaScript programming within them, which is really a publishing issue, not a programming issue, which I think we're going to eventually get there. Or we need to really expand what the actions and triggers and stuff can do, because right now it's pretty limited. We're really limited by these pieces of software. I tell people it's very similar to when you buy a car and the car can only go like 90 miles per hour. There's something called a governor on the car. And if you take that governor off, you can go like 120 miles an hour. Same with like your cell phone. Like if you've ever heard like your cell phone's jailbroken, like jailbreak it. Very similar with these pieces of software. There's a lot of limitations on them based on what the developers have decided. So we're back at square one where we were with Director, Authorware, and Toolbook right now. And I have hope that we're going to get a little more advanced in the future. But that brings me to my original statement where I said this video is for those who are going to be developing e-learning and stuff. And if you're banking your career on e-learning development, I will tell you right now that you're going to need to learn to be a computer programmer. Because as soon as Captivate and Articulate get smart, which they're not right now, we're just getting there. As soon as they do a better job of implementing and integrating JavaScript, or they create their own language, which Flash had, you're going to need to learn how to program in that. And we're going to be back to where we were when Flash was this new piece of software on the scene that allowed you to do everything. And what's going to happen is your clients are going to expect you to do everything like they did with Flash. And that's what I see happening. And I'm really excited for that to happen because the software is too limited right now. I'm excited for that expansion. And it's going to be cool. It's going to be exciting. And it's going to be neat to see. I also love the programming aspect of things. So I'm excited for that to finally take hold, because we need it. Otherwise, we're going to have these, basic cookie cutter presentations. And I'm seeing the next versions of Articulate and Captivate, talking to the developers and excited about some of the things that they're talking about. So I have a lot of faith in the future of our software for the instructional design field. But those are kind of my thoughts and kind of like my walk down memory lane of what I experienced as an e-learning developer over the last 20 years. Hope you enjoyed. Later all.